Okay, hello everyone. Hello Science Marchers. I'm Lucky Tran. I'm the Managing Director for March for Science. Thanks for joining us today. Happy New Year to you all. I'd like to begin today by thanking everyone in the community for all your amazing work last year. It was really a difficult time in 2020, but you did such incredible work. You served on the front lines of the pandemic to save lives. You marched and organized for racial justice. And you made science one of the top issues in the last election and helped elect a president who listens to science. Thank you so much. But of course, our work doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop at the end of 2020. We have so much to do in 2021 to keep fighting for science and justice. And right away, we have another important election. 2 runoffs in Georgia this Tuesday that will decide the balance of power in the Senate. And to talk about science activism and Georgia, we have a very special guest today. Corina Newsome is the Community Engagement Manager for Georgia Audubon and a biology master's student at Georgia Southern University. Corina, who began in the field of wildlife conservation as a zookeeper, currently conducts research to conserve the MacGillivray Seaside Sparrow and connects people with birds across the state of Georgia. Having experienced the hurdles faced by people of color interested in wildlife careers, she has founded several programs to encourage high school students from underrepresented demographics to consider careers in wildlife sciences. Corina's mission is to center the perspectives and leadership of historically oppressed communities in wildlife conservation, environmental education, and exploration of the natural world. Welcome, Corina, and Happy New Year.
Lucky, thank you so much. Happy New Year to you as well. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've always admired the work that you all have done since your inception. So thank you so much for having me.
And thank you so much for being here. Right back at you. We've been so inspired by all the work you've done throughout your career. So it's a true honor to have you on here today. Okay, actually, first question. I just found out this was a thing yesterday, seeing you tweet about it. What was your first bird of the year?
My first bird of 2021, which you always have to pay attention to and figure out why that means it's a good omen, was the Tufted Tit Mouse, which is a funny sounding bird, but it's a very energetic bird, very cute, in fact, with a nice little mohawk on top of the head. You never miss it, but it was a great start to the year.
That's so awesome. I think I live in a concrete jungle in New York City, so I think mine was actually the starling, which is everywhere. But you know, it was in Shakespeare, so I'm going to take that part as a good omen. You know,
they're amazing birds. So that's
these
okay.
things. All buzzing, right, in their own different ways. Mm-hmm. So on that, tell us about your research and your work in science and what sparked your passion in birds and the natural world.
Yeah, so I'll start with the last question, kind of what sparked my passion for birds. So I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in Germantown, if many of you are familiar. And I was in a similar kind of situation when it comes to a concrete jungle. There are more trees in Philadelphia than, say, in New York City, but I wasn't taught to really recognize wildlife in the city. But I always was reading about wildlife in books. So I knew a lot about exotic wildlife, but nothing about native species. I ended up, going through my, grade school years, determined to be a veterinarian until a Black woman who was a zookeeper at the Philadelphia Zoo, her name is Michelle Jamison. She was the lead carnivore keeper there. She reached out to me through a mutual friend and exposed me to a whole world of conservation that I never knew existed and that I never saw anyone represented like myself in anything even close to it, right? So after seeing her do her work and being exposed to that field, my whole trajectory changed for my career, and I went on to get a degree in zoo and wildlife biology from Malone University, and that's actually where my love for birds was sparked. As part of my degree, I had to take a class called ornithology, which is the study of birds, and I had heard about that class from my first day on campus, right? And they're like, oh, you're gonna have to take this class where you have to memorize 150 native birds, and I was like, there are 150 native birds. Like that concept was so, I couldn't believe it. And so I was dreading it, honestly, because I knew nothing about native wildlife, especially not native birds. I got into my first class for ornithology, and my teacher, Dr. Jason Corder, threw up a picture of a blue jay on the screen, and I yelled in class. I was like, what is that? Like, I'd heard of a blue jay, but I'd never seen a blue jay, and certainly didn't expect them to look like that. And from that moment forward, I was like, okay, there's a whole lot that I'm missing, especially in the bird world. and I've been stalking birds ever since. So that's kind of where my love for birds originated. And so ever since that day, I knew I wanted to contribute to the conservation of birds, the protection of birds, particularly helping them survive in a changing world. And so after about 4 years of zookeeping, once I graduated from college, I started looking for programs, for labs essentially, that were doing research around understanding what do we need to know to help birds survive in a changing world. And so that's what brought me to Georgia Southern University under the direction of Elizabeth Hunter, my advisor. And in her, under her leadership, I am studying a bird, as you mentioned, called the MacGillivray Seaside Sparrow that resides on the coastal marshes of North America, both on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. But I'm specifically studying populations in Georgia, and the subspecies that I'm studying is only found in South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. So I am looking specifically at nest predation. That means that I am out there spying on birds. I've got video cameras, I've got camera traps that are trying to assess if there's a spatial pattern to where nest predation happens most often. And the reason why that question is particularly important for them, they are one of the most kind of like threatened birds when it comes to the effects of climate change. They're on the coast, so sea level rise is a problem, as it is for wildlife and people, right, who are living on the coast. And with them, they're kind of in a touchy situation where they nest in the marsh grass and it's a tidal environment, right? So it gets flooded regularly, twice a day. If they nest too low, they'll get flooded and they'll lose their offspring. But if they nest too high, they will be seen by predators. So they're caught between these two opposing threats. It's only going to get worse as climate change intensifies, as sea level rise makes high tides higher. So I'm studying the nest predation side of those opposing threats, trying to understand where nest predation is happening most often and giving wildlife managers the information that they would need to kind of employ wildlife management practices to help protect those birds as sea level rise gets worse.
That's so awesome and such important work. Thank you so much for doing all of that. Speaking of conservation, I'd love to hear, you were recently hired by Georgia Audubon, an amazing organization, right? I'd love to hear about your work there and what you're doing there.
Yes, so I was recently hired by Georgia Audubon, actually in August. I started in the middle of August as the new community engagement manager for Georgia Audubon. And so that's actually, not only am I new to the job, it's a new position because Georgia Audubon is just expanded from Atlanta Audubon to Georgia Audubon. And so we are expanding the programs that we already have that connect our communities across Georgia with birds. And our mission is to create places, to build places where birds and people thrive, which is one of the things that really drew me to Georgia Audubon, because oftentimes in the conservation space, we have seen a history of being very laser focused on wildlife specifically and not really understanding the intersection of the lives of people and wildlife conservation, protection, and management. And so because Georgia Audubon in their mission, right, they kind of demonstrate that intersection and the importance of focusing on both, I was like, you know what, I want to learn more. And as I've gotten to know Georgia Audubon and now to work for Georgia Audubon, I've been very grateful and also encouraged by the work that they've done in their communities. And so a lot of my work involves, as I said, expanding the programs that we already have, from focusing just in Atlanta to being spread across Georgia, whether it's conservation, education, or other programming, but also centering equity in all of the programming that we do, both old and new. And so incorporating, you know, the understanding and the education and engagement of communities that have historically been kind of isolated off or cut off from conservation work, whether you're talking about Black, Indigenous, peoples of color, you're talking about people with disabilities, LGBTQIA individuals, people who have, you know, been pushed into the margins of society, and who, you know, oftentimes people seem to struggle to understand, well, how does someone having a disability or someone being Black or someone being LGBTQIA, how does that intersect with conservation or climate change or these environmental issues? How do they interact? And they interact very, very closely, right? They have very important impacts and interactions, and helping to address those issues, to address the systemic exclusion of those people groups is central to the work of conservation and also central to my work at Georgia Audubon. And so I'm currently in the process of collaboratively creating programs that exist to serve those communities and to center, as you mentioned, center their perspectives and center their leadership and position the resources that Georgia Audubon has to best serve those communities. Because what we've seen is that power and resources are really concentrated among white people in the United States, white, especially middle, upper class people in the United States. And so the reason why I, venture to enter into these white spaces is because I understand that power needs to be redistributed. And that's the work that I do at Georgia Audubon and that I will continue to do no matter where I am.
Thank you. That's so exciting to hear. I'm so excited by that program and seeing these things really expand into all sorts of nonprofits and different spaces in science. And, speaking of which, you were an organizer with Black Birders Week, which I think was one of the most inspiring movements in science last year for me, I think. And the whole Black in STEM movement, right? Black in Euro, Black in biology, Black in, marine biology. It was so amazing to see that movement sweep across and have these important voices amplified. Tell me about how that got started and how it's changing the face of science.
Yeah, there's a group chat, honestly, is what it was. There was a group chat of about 100 or so Black people who literally met on Twitter, who were either professionals in the STEM space or recreational outdoors people who, connected with STEM in some capacity. We were all in this group chat that was started by a friend of mine named Jason Ward, who is a birder here in Atlanta, where I live as well. We were just hanging out earlier today, actually. And it was just a space for us to connect and be Black AF together. You know what I'm saying? And to talk about and kind of find community in our common ground as far as our identity and our experiences, and just have fun as well, right? So that had been in existence for probably a year or so. And then this past summer, Christian Cooper, who is a Black birder, a man who many of us had certainly heard of, and even a few people in the group knew him. He's from New York City, just like Jason actually is, Jason Ward. And his sister posted a video that he had taken of a white woman calling the police on him for him asking her to leash her dog in a wildlife area in Central Park that you're not supposed to have your dog off leash. The dog was running around. He asked her, "Hey, can you please leash your dog?" And then she wouldn't do it. And so he was like, "I have dog treats," and she calls the police and says that an African-American man is threatening her life, right? Literally attempting to lying to the police, A, and B, attempting to weaponize the police against this Black man. And Christian, not that he needs any qualification, right? It doesn't matter what his accolades are or are not. It doesn't matter what his identity is or is not. That was wrong. But on top of that, Christian is just such a beautiful person, a wonderful person, a kind, gentle person. And so it was especially disorienting to us who knew that about him, right? And then that very same day, George Floyd was killed by the police. And the combination of those two things was heart-wrenching. And of course, that video, we saw it immediately and it made it to the group chat, and we started talking about it, and we were just kind of processing it. And then one of my friends who's in that chat named Anna, she is an economist actually, so not really into the outdoors very much at all, but she said, we need to do something to celebrate Black birders. And then my friend Taiki, who works for National Audubon, jumped in and was like, we need to have a week for Black birders, and then from that moment, within 2 days, literally 48 hours, everyone kind of poured in ideas, poured in their talents, their gifts, and said, "Hey, I'll do this to support." Some people made, the hashtag list. Some people made a schedule, made graphics, all kinds of stuff, used their contacts to spread the word. And then we, with literally, like I said, 2 days of planning, we started Black Birders Week on a Sunday. I think it was May 31st. And it blew my mind, right? I knew we had some, power-packed people in the group, right? That was never a question. But to see the way that it was received across the country as well as across the world was very mind-blowing to me. And I want to be clear that people people supporting in word, right? And, public-facing statements is cool. It's certainly not enough, right? And they're certainly late to the party. Despite that, I was very surprised to see institutions like National Audubon Society and even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Wildlife Federation and all of these, either organizations or government agencies or what have you, uplifting our voices on their platforms. I was shocked that they did that. I was like, oh my gosh, and because of, people spreading word and institutions and organizations spreading the word, we were able to reach a very large volume of people. And I think the most encouraging thing for me out of Black Birders Week was being able to see that there are so many more Black people doing what we in this group chat do than I could have ever imagined. One of the the woes, I guess, of being Black in these spaces is that when it comes to our physical interactions, we're oftentimes the only Black people that we see ourselves, you know what I mean? And so whenever we can see other Black people doing what we do, it's reaffirming, it's encouraging. It's like a celebratory moment, right? We make connections. We build capacity for activism that way too, which is why, Lucky, as you mentioned, after Black Bears Week, we saw the surfacing of all kinds of Black in STEM weeks, Black in neuro, Black in marine biology, Black in cardiology, Black in botany, like all kinds of organizing, because people are able to be connected. And social media is a really powerful mechanism for making that happen. So Black Bears Week was definitely life-changing for me. And the point is to celebrate Black people in these spaces and to uproot white supremacy in STEM, right? And what I've learned since seeing all these other Black in STEM weeks is that white supremacy manifests in ways that I never even conceptualized, because I'm not in those fields, you know what I mean? And so to learn, to both celebrate and learn myself has been extremely eye-opening.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important and critical. So one of the things that was heartening to me, sort of late to the party, but sort of heartening, was over the summer, you know, in response to such a tragic event, the murder of George Floyd, right? To see so many, particularly, you know, people, scientists in the streets who had never really marched or organized or participated in activism before, getting out there and raising their voices for racial justice. And as you said, it was pretty amazing, you know, because of the work that you and others did, to see establishment scientific groups sort of put out statements and, you know, sort of say, we're part of this cause. So yeah, I'd love to hear about why you think it's important for scientists to, you know, be activists and get involved in racial justice work. And also, I guess, what more do we need to do, right? Because I do think, you know, as we said, you know, it is late to the party. Having statements is great, or, you know, changing names on problematic monuments or buildings is great, but I think we need real structural change, right? So what would you like to see happen within science as well? I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, you know, as we've touched on, it's important that people say and make statements and declare stances, right? But the most important thing is to follow up with structural change. And so one of the kind of lines I've been hearing a lot, like from my friends and on social media, is that, you know, people, you know, we've heard this rhetoric. We've heard rhetoric oftentimes, whether it's in the recreational outdoor space or in the actual like academia, whatever. We've heard this, you know, don't bring politics into X, Y, Z. Don't bring politics into this or into that. Don't bring race into this or into that. This, you know, let's silo science. Let's silo outdoor exploration because we're just here for the birds, or we're just here to do our lab work, or we're just, you know what I mean? And that position, that perspective is a mark of privilege, right? I can't afford to only think about science when I'm out in South Georgia on the coast as a Black woman by myself, right? Out in the marsh in a protected area that you need a permit to be in, but I don't look like someone probably who has a permit, right? It's like when you're not in the power holding majority, you can't afford to have a unidimensional understanding of science or any of these spaces. And so one of the things that I want to see from scientists and from the realm of science, whether it's kind of recreational, community science, or it's academic, or whatever, however it manifests and wherever it is, people must have an intersectional understanding of science, because science has always been political. Science has always affected people's lives, right? People's daily lives, whether you're talking about conservation and wildlife, or you're talking about medicine, right? It's always been political. And when we decide to not allow people's perspectives, people's stories, the lived experience of people to enter and inform science, we will continue to perpetuate the exploitation, the exclusion, right? The detriment, essentially, of historically marginalized communities. Again, Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQIA individuals, people with disabilities, right? And when we prevent their perspectives from being incorporated into our work, we are perpetuating their continued oppression. And so when it comes to, and I think about wildlife conservation in particular quite a bit, and now medicine more than I ever have, because I'm learning so much, especially with this pandemic, is we see how inequities play out in medicine, in access to medical care, right? Even with this COVID-19 pandemic, right? Who has access to medical expertise? Who do we believe, right? who do we believe as far as medical experts are concerned? Because there is a history of exploitation and murder of Black people. So like us not trusting the medical field is completely valid. Like there are so many ways in which the threads of human lived experiences intersect science. And so what I want people in science to do is to seek out the perspectives of historically oppressed and currently oppressed communities in whatever they're doing. It doesn't matter if you're in medicine, if you're in wildlife conservation, if you're in some other field of STEM, engineering, whatever it is, seek out the perspectives of these people, particularly in the leadership that you have, right? So it's one thing to be a white institution going out and surveying and chatting with people of these, marginalized communities. It's another thing to relinquish your power, right? Because as long as you hold the power, those communities, again, you will act in your best interest. So we need to be putting people from these communities in the decision-making positions, in these institutions, in these fields of study. We need to be actively participating in our democracy, because whether, again, same situation, whether you're talking about engineering, math, economics, so wildlife conservation, medicine, there are policy decisions that are made, whether it's at the federal level, right, with our federal government, or at the local level affecting, more, microcosms of human communities in the United States. Many decisions are being made at legislative levels. And if we're not participating and voting and advocating for sound legislation that is sound when it comes to science, that is sound when it comes to human rights, that is sound when it comes to environmental health, right? Like if we're not voting and engaging with our leadership and with our leaders and electing leaders that align with these values and these principles, our fields of study are going to suffer. We're not even going to be able to accomplish what we want to accomplish as scientists or as whatever professionals we are, or recreational participants that we are. We're not going to be able to accomplish our goals if we're not participating in our democracy. And so one of the really awesome things that I've seen manifest over this last administration even has been things like March for Science, where it's like institutions that have historically, felt most comfortable being siloed have really been moving the needle when it comes to civic engagement, when it comes to participating in our democracy. And that is particularly very encouraging to me, being someone whose existence in science is necessarily intersectional, right? To see that kind of work happening. Of course, there is a long way to go. There is such a long way to go. And it requires that these institutions be held accountable. And one of the things, again, that I love about what's been happening with the Black and STEM movement is that it's hard to make waves in your institution when you're the only one in a room, right? But and kind of one of the detriments has been is that we're all separated from each other. But now that we're connected, we can actually build capacity and work and operate as a unit and actually make waves to hold these institutions accountable for these results that we want to see. That I just described. And so I more than, people have said, we've seen civil rights movements happen in the past, and the needle will move somewhat, but then we kind of revert to, the old ways, the old system of maintaining white supremacy in all of these spaces, right? I think that there is a different energy and a different capacity here because of the internet, because of social media, and that we are able to mobilize in a new way, in a way that I think will actually bring lasting and structural change to the institutions that we're part of.
I loved everything that you said there. I think something in particular that I think is really important is, I think social justice and racial justice and social change really involves, looking at power and the balance of power, right? And how to shift that balance of power to dismantle the systems of oppression. That's so important. And, speaking of which, part of that is politics. It's not a dirty word. As you said, science is political, always has been political. And I think last year showed that more than ever, right? And so we've got this. One of the reasons why we're excited to talk to you today as a Georgia scientist is that you've got a big thing happening in your state again. After everything that happened in the election a couple of months ago, the general election, we have a big Senate runoff, right, coming up. So why is the Senate and, that runoff and the balance of power of the Senate so important for what you do as a scientist, and why is it important for social justice policy in general?
Yeah, so in Georgia, we are electing 2 senators in this election on January 5th. That, as Lucky mentioned, will determine the balance of power in the Senate. And it's so important that this balance of power be shifted, of course, because we have Joe Biden elected, and when you have a House and a Senate that are on the same page, so to speak, right, you can get a lot more done than if there is a great divide. And the work that I'm doing with Georgia Audubon, to be clear, is nonpartisan, right? So we're not ever talking about specific candidates. We're often, particularly with this election, we're not even necessarily advocating for specific positions. We're just trying to get people out to vote and use their voice. But when it comes to actually doing science, right, it's so interesting because I was literally on phone calls, I guess, before the presidential election, right? I was trying to make decisions with some partners with Georgia Audubon about programming and science and outreach that we wanted to do. And we were like, we don't know if we'll have funding to be able to do this. The next election will determine that, right? So it was like, we're literally waiting on making decisions about our science based on who's in power, because funding was sliced, when I tell you sliced, cut, under the previous administration for doing a lot of the science that we do in Georgia and around, of course, around the country, when it surrounds conservation and environmental protection, right? And so similarly, though, so now we have a president who makes decisions in favor of science, and we will hold him accountable to continue to do what he's claimed, right? But now a similar situation is afoot, where in order for some of these decisions to be carried out to fruition, right? Like, in order for us to see the manifestation of the funds that we need, or the support that we need to carry out conservation work or equity work, social justice work, there needs to be, a lot of unity, so to speak. There needs to be people on the same page in our Congress and in the presidency. And so it's so important that we are voting in this election, people who care about science and care about equity and justice, because we'll be much more capable of getting things done. And just to give you an idea, Georgia is such an interesting place because there are so many, actually the South in general, but the Southeast United States is an interesting place because there have been several situations in which wildlife conservation, the intersection of wildlife conservation and human rights and racial equity have manifested, right? But in a bad way. And one of the things that I think about is, off the top of my head, so if you've ever been to Georgia, there's a beautiful national wildlife refuge called Harris Neck National Wildlife Refuge. And I mean, it's stunning. There's a rookery there. You see thousands and thousands of nesting birds. I mean, it's just incredibly biodiverse. It's the bomb. But if you know the history of the Harris Neck National Wildlife Refuge, you'll find that land was owned by Black families. And it was essentially taken by the government. They were given like pennies for their land, given no money for their businesses, right? And they were in the oyster business. They were in all kinds of businesses, right? That land was stripped from them, and the resources were stripped from them to support World War II efforts. And then when that was over, they didn't give it back to them. They didn't give it back. Instead, they turned it into a national wildlife refuge, which seems great, right? Like from the outside, it's like, oh yes, we turned what was a World War II, airfield into a wildlife refuge. But the inequity there is glaring. But that story is not even told. It's not even on the government website when they tell the story of Harris Neck Wildlife Refuge. And so it's not only important, right, that we have people elected in office who care about conservation, who care about funding work to protect wildlife in the outdoors. They have to care about people too. They have to care about the justice for people who are in actively and historically oppressed communities. And so this election, I'm not speaking on behalf of Georgia Audubon or anyone else. I'm speaking on behalf of myself alone. There are candidates who are clearly for the people, and those who seem to be very much not for the people. And so I always encourage people to do your research about the candidates that are up for election, whether we're talking about federal elections or we're talking about local elections, because those decisions that they're going to make in the future are going to impact people's personal lives, the income that families have to support each other, to support their families, the resources that are available for wildlife scientists, for scientists in general. And so it's really important that people are participating in this election, because it will have tangible impacts on both science, social justice, and their intersection, as we've seen play out many times, right? And I'm gonna say one more thing, Lucky. In a situation with climate change that we're in right now, Georgia, a lot of people don't realize that Georgia has a coast. We have a coast, a very beautiful coast. Coastal communities are some of the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change, for the reason that I mentioned at the beginning: sea level rise, right? And storms, extreme weather events. And there is not a lot of infrastructure to protect those people and to protect their survival when these, intensified weather events happen and continue to happen, and sea level rise happens and continues to happen. And so we need to be making overarching, large-scale legislative decisions that protect people in a changing world, not just wildlife, but wildlife and people too.
Absolutely. I mean, climate change is such a key issue, right? And I think, the key part is that it's here now, and it involves people, particularly people who have been historically oppressed or marginalized, right? Our people, for me, like, I'm an immigrant, a refugee, and one of the reasons climate change is such a big issue for me is I know that our communities have had, the places they've lived taken away from them. And, my relatives around the global south continue to have that. So, it's such an important issue. And that's what's on the ticket, right? That's so important. Tell us, I'd love to talk about, so something that's interesting to me, we've talked about, you've made it really clear how important that, voting is for science and social justice issues. But when you look at it, previous studies have shown that, STEM majors have really poor voter records. They don't vote as much as other majors. And it's the same, I know, I think the Environmental Voter Project is a partner on some of your phone bankings. And they've shown that, environmental people who care about the environment are actually poor voters too. So I always find that interesting. So I'd love to talk about why you think that is, what we can do about it, and, what the importance of voting and why we really need to fight to make it more accessible, because that's the other side of the coin, right? Because there is voter suppression, there are, real problems with our voter system. And of course, your great state and the amazing organizers like Stacey Abrams, everyone knows how amazing Stacey is, but so many thousands of grassroots organizers, who are doing amazing work to open up access to voting. So yeah, tell me more about that. I'd love to hear more about, why voting is important and how we can change it to make it more accessible.
Yeah, so I think kind of to your first question about like why is it, and this is just me postulating, I don't know, but from my anecdotal interactions with environmental folks, whether we're talking about career natural scientists or we're talking about just recreational birders, some of the language that I've heard goes back to what I mentioned before, where it's like, I'm here for the birds, or I care about, this single thing. And there doesn't seem to be, first of all, a lot of education around the intersectionality of environmental issues and human issues, human rights issues in our school system. So I think that people are not really, a large majority of the population is not necessarily positioned to think critically that way. Of course, people who are in these marginalized communities understand very well that when we say sea level rise is impacting wildlife, they know it's impacting themselves too, because their house is flooded, right? Their house gets flooded multiple times a year in the rain, in the hurricane season. Like, it's not the people who are in the marginalized communities who don't understand this intersectionality. It's often the majority who don't, from my experience. And so, because of that, it's critically important that we, number one, educate people in as many ways as we can about why and how these environmental issues intersect with the lives of people and intersect with policy, right? Because again, there's not a whole lot of education around that. And so there are some really phenomenal organizations like Earth Tomorrow Atlanta. Oh gosh, I cannot sing their praises enough. They're an organization that are training and educating youth. I think they're in high school, getting them, teaching them outside of school. They're not a school program, right? They're an independent program of the National Wildlife Federation, actually, that are training young people in understanding how social justice and environmental justice intersect with wildlife conservation and environmental protection, and getting them active, even before they're old enough to actually vote, getting them active in getting other people to vote and getting them to understand the importance of civic engagement. And so first of all, education is a really important piece, and I would definitely encourage people to participate in that kind of education and sharing that knowledge as often as possible. But when it comes to accessibility in voting, right? Like I said, so the people who are the most negatively impacted by the issues that are affecting wildlife and people are often the most voter suppressed, right? You got people cutting the number of polling locations. You got people cutting the hours of polling locations in areas where a lot of people don't have cars, right? Or people who can't afford to just not go to work to go vote, to stand for for literally like 9-10 hours in a line to vote. People can't afford to do that. And so voter suppression, a lot of people are, imagine some sort of maybe very obvious and glaring, event that means voter suppression. No, voter suppression can be very sinister and can kind of fly under the radar of people for whom that reality does not exist. You taking a day off to vote doesn't affect you, or you have a car, right? All these little pieces that a lot of people aren't aware of feed into the suppression of voters who stand to lose the most if their voices are not heard in our representatives, among our representatives, both locally again and at the federal level. And so the work of organizations like the New Georgia Project with Stacey Abrams, or the NAACP, or any number of like organizations in Georgia and around the country, Environmental Voter Project, right, to both kind of fill that gap, that resource gap that is kind of feeding the inequities when it comes to access to voting, right? So for example, I can't remember the name of the organization, but there's an organization that like is providing free Uber rides to and from the polling locations for everyone in Georgia, right? There are organizations that are, essentially putting in resources where voter suppression attempts to keep people away from the polls. So there's so much work being done around that kind of that suppression issue, but we have to hold our elected officials accountable for these glaring inequities that are oftentimes not obvious to most people. And so it's been really an honor to be able to do any work around mobilizing voters. And one of the reasons why Environmental Voter Project is so cool, they are the organization that Georgia Audubon is partnering with for our phone banking efforts for the Georgia Senate election, along with the Vote, which is a group of people, a grassroots organization that is getting birders specifically out to vote and getting their constituents and their family and friends out to vote. Environmental Voter Project is so cool because they are essentially, like Lucky said, targeting people who have expressed concern for the environment, right, but are not active voters. And simply providing resources, right? Here's where your polling location is. Do you have any questions? Do you need a ride to the polls? Here's resources to get you there. Are you aware of your polling location, of the dates, of the ways to vote? Just providing people, with reminders, not that Georgia has any short of reminders at this point, but connecting people with the resources that they need to be able to make a plan to vote. Because you don't want to get caught, right, with no idea of where to vote, when to vote, how to vote. And it's January 5th, right? So we're trying to do everything we can to get people set up with the information that they need by January 5th to participate in the US Senate runoff election. So being able to contribute, again, to mobilizing voters, especially those who are likely to vote in favor of environmental protection and human rights and justice, getting them out to vote is so important. And so that's why we actually have, Lucky, is it okay if I plug it right now or something? Okay, cool. So Georgia Audubon, we've had 2 so far. We have 1 more phone banking event that's going to be happening tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, from 3 to 5 p.m. It might sound like a long time, but the time actually flies by quite quickly. And if you can't say the whole time, that's totally fine. But they're going to put a link in the chat that will direct you to a registration page. And essentially what we're going to be doing is calling people who have not yet voted. So there's a kind of a constantly updated list of people who have and haven't voted in Georgia. We're going to be calling people who are listed as having not voted yet, but people who are shown to be not likely voters, but interested in environmental and concerned about environmental issues. And so we're going to be spending our final day in this final push, again, because election day is January 5th. So we want to make sure everyone is set to go. And that's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. So I really encourage you to join us. I'll be there along with representatives from the Vote, because we're all activists. Auks are a kind of bird, if you have not heard of those before, and the Environmental Voter Project. So thank you for allowing me to plug that.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And I think you mentioned the org who's providing lift rides to the polls. That's Plus One Vote, our friends at Plus One Vote. Awesome organization. So if you need a ride, get in touch with them. That's really cool. Before we wrap this up, is there anything else you want to plug? How can people get involved with Black Birders Week or Black and STEM, for instance? Anything to do with your work, let us know.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, social media is really turning out to be the platform and the kind of the mechanism by which so much really important organizing is happening. And one thing, in addition to connecting all these kind of previously isolated individuals in the STEM space who are Black or of other marginalized people groups is that not only are we connected with each other, we are also able to publicly hold these institutions accountable, right? Because before there were social media, it could be difficult, or it could have been difficult to like hold institutions accountable in a way that matters to them. But when it's on a public stage, right, they stand to lose a lot if they don't respond, like financial support, resource support, constituents, right? So it's a phenomenal capacity to get engaged. So there's some social medias that I want you to follow. First, you can follow Black AF in STEM. So yeah, Black AF in STEM on Instagram and Twitter. That's the handle, again, Black AF in STEM. And you can kind of keep up with the work that's that organization is doing. They were the ones who organized Black Birders Week, which I was a part of, an honor to be a part of. If you're interested in following me in particular on social media, my Instagram handle is hood__naturalist. And on Twitter, it's hood_naturalist. And so you can feel free to follow me there and keep up with the work that I'm doing with Georgia Audubon and with other organizations as conservation changes its face and its values, right? So if you want to be a part of that, I would encourage you to follow those organizations and kind of share and uplift the voices of the people that you see being shared on those platforms, because again, it's important not only that organizations are speaking out and saying, yes, we support X, Y, and Z. It's important for them to directly uplift the voices of those very people. And so I would encourage you to do that on social media, because it is definitely a very powerful platform.
All right, that's so awesome. Thank you so much for all your critical work and your voice, and for joining us today, Corina. I wish you all the best of luck for all the big, awesome work that you're going to do over the next few days, and Happy New Year. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lucky. Happy New Year to all of you. Thank you.
Bye. I'd love to check in now with our organizing director, Cody Hankerson. Cody, Happy New Year. How are you doing?
Happy New Year. I am surviving very well. I'm feeling good. I'm hopeful. Did all the special rituals with the black eyed peas and everything to try and make
gotta do them.
Gotta do everything.
We need all the help we can get, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That's awesome. So yeah, Georgia, give us a rundown. What's happening? Where are we at? How can people vote, and how can they volunteer and get involved with March for Science?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, Corina just gave out a huge amount of really, really awesome resources, not only for you to follow during this election that's on January 5th, which is just in 3 days now, but also just past this election. And that's what we're starting to get in tune for. Now, as far as how you can get involved with us here at March for Science Action, is just to follow the link that's going to be put into the comment section, and then just choose a volunteer team out. Corina was completely right about social media being a huge tool for organizing, especially in a world where there's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars dropped on this race as far as TV and radio, but there's also going to be a huge battle against misinformation. So just as far as when your polling location is going to be available, Georgia, as everybody there knows, is a big place, and there's very complex. If you have a rainstorm, or if something happens at a location. So all these different things are going to be really, really important for you to follow us, not only on our March for Science Action main page, but also in our groups that we have. And for those of you who have already signed up to volunteer, thank you. There's been hundreds of you. I'm super excited to introduce you into the team. From there, we're going to be doing phone banks. Postcards are a little bit past now, but there's also going to be a ton of research, data analytics that we need to do, production, programming, and content. Like I said, this is really a battle of information. And so if you want to get involved, a lot of the process of saying hey, this is why this or X issue is really going to be important in this election, or hey, here's an official list of where polling locations are in Georgia. All of these things take time to compile. And so for us to come together and share that information and make it as easy as possible for those in Georgia to vote in 3 days is going to be really, really important. And so that's what we're working on right now.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Cody, for joining us today. And yeah, thank you for everyone else for joining us today. We wish you all a safer, healthier, and happier new year. And thank you for everything you did in 2020. You did some incredible work. As we said, it's not enough to just elect a president who listens to science. We need to keep pushing for science and social justice over the next year and for many years to come. So, keep speaking up, keep volunteering, and keep fighting in 2021. Let's do this, everyone.